Treaty of Paris is one of the most important documents in American history. It acknowledges, from Great Britain's point of view, American independence. They weren't happy about it. The king would later call it a separation, but it did become a reality. The United States extends to the Mississippi River. Our neighbor across the river is, of course, the nation of Spain. Spain gets back Florida, so there's some land and territory that changes hands. And the British promise eventually to leave the forts that they occupy on American soil. So yes, there are still British soldiers in the United States. And the British remind us, as part of the Treaty of Paris, those soldiers will leave when you, the United States, pay us the debts that you owed us before the war started. Just because you won your independence doesn't mean that all of you debtors in the American colonies still do not owe us money. The Scottish and English creditors, which you had borrowed money on future things like your tobacco or rice or indigo crop, you still owe us that money. So we evaluate the 1780s, the decade really specifically from 1783, the Treaty of Paris, until the onset of the call of the Constitutional Convention, is often called by historians, because historians love to give these eras these dramatic names, the critical years, or as I put with a question mark, the critical years, as if maybe they're not as critical as some people would like you to believe. As I left off last time, two schools of thought, not only by people who lived back then, but by people who live today. This is the idea that the United States, in the aftermath of the revolution, was on the brink of collapse. Or others say, no, we weren't. We were struggling, but we'll get through it. To this day, we argue about it. So we're going to evaluate whether or not the decade was a time of real peril for the nation, the new infant United States, or was it just a way for a certain group in the country who wanted to create stronger powers of the government, including people like Alexander Hamilton, who will later be called the nationalists because they want to enhance the power of the national government? Was this group responsible for leading us down the path to the Constitutional Convention by doing, among other things, dramatizing the failures of the United States and the failure specifically of the existing government? To this day, we're still having arguments about it. And these are still active arguments because to this day, we talk about what power should be given to the government when the government oversteps its bounds, how much you should share power between the national government and the state governments, and then within the state governments, the people themselves, who are part of the shared sovereignty, as the word is, the sovereignty within the United States. So let's begin this discussion by looking at three areas where the United States faces critical changes and critical challenges. The economy. The economy, of course, has to deal with, getting distracted there. I saw something flash on the screen. Okay, that we're not part of the English Empire anymore. When we were colonies, we enjoyed certain advantages. We flew underneath the English flag. And if you started to mess around with American ships that sailed out of places like South Carolina or New York or Philadelphia or Boston, you would have to answer to the British. That's not the case anymore. So the economy is one section. Trade, we would say, another, and trade is linked to the economy. Would the English, now that we are not part of the English Empire or Great Britain, allow us to operate freely around the world? Because they have the greatest navy in the world, and we have, no navy at all, and no money to actually build a navy. And the third category, I might say, is foreign presence on the continent. We're going to look at the Spanish and English efforts to what I would effectively say stunt the growth of the United States, maybe in a policy of containment. I'll explain what I mean by that as we go a little bit further along. The economy was hurting. There is no doubt about it. There was a post-war, probably equivalent of a depression in 1783. The English decided to make life difficult for us. I mean, they had to accept independence. They didn't have to like it. And we are a threat because we are sharing a continent with the British, who are still in Canada. The Spanish see as a threat the same way, as literally a dagger pointed at their colonies of Louisiana and Central America, Mexico, all the way down the continent. So we have to find new markets, does the United States, for our products. So the economy is hurting. We are no longer are able to take American-built ships and bring British goods around the world. It's called the carrying trade. It's there in the notes. That had been very instrumental in building the New England maritime economy, the carrying trade. The British say, no, American ships can't take British goods. It's like they're putting the navigation acts from 100 years before on her former colonies. That's going to hurt us. But at the same time, we're not limited about where we are banned from trading. So American shippers find new markets, begin to open up South America, Asia, parts of the world we really had never sailed to previously to the American Revolution. So every part of the economy is hurting. New England, middle colonies, and the South especially, because 10% of Southern slaves are gone as a result of the American Revolution. We talk about slave rebellions in American history. This is the greatest one prior to the American Civil War. We don't talk about it in that context, but we should, because we're talking about tens of thousands of African American slaves who either find their freedom going to the British armies, evacuate by British navies, escape to areas of the North, or simply win their freedom by joining a Continental Army unit. We know that about a fifth of the Continental Army, upwards of 5,000 soldiers, were African Americans, joining militia and other ways they could achieve their freedom. Whatever side promised them the ability of freedom, they'd go to that, whether it be the Patriot or the Revolutionary side or the British. So that was going to, of course, impact the Southern economy, where slavery continued to be legal. Tobacco, rice, indigo would take years to rebound their pre-war production. And the Southern states demanded that their access to overseas slave trade continued without any impediment by the national government. The British also, and this is related to what we're seeing in, I would say accurately, foreign presence on the continent. Let me pull up the share tray here and look at there we go. Okay, so this looks impressive. It's the idea that the United States was no longer confined to the Appalachian Mountains as we had been at the end of the French and Indian War. The United States now expands to the Mississippi River. So that sets this whole thing in perspective. But you can see that we share the continent, continue to share the continent with other powers on the continent and overseas. The Spanish in Louisiana, the British in Canada, tens of thousands of Native Americans who live from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and don't think they lost the revolution either. They sided with the British. The British lost. We fought with the side that lost, but still plan on maintaining our autonomy and our ability to make our own decisions. The American perspective, the Indians sided with the British. They lost. Now they get the hell out of our way. That wasn't going to happen. So the foreign presence on the continent, illustrated on this map by, you can see at the very bottom, the red square indicates British-held forts. These are forts on or near American soil that the British maintain soldiers. Some of them are in American territory. What are they doing there? I already said why. The British say they're not going to evacuate or go to the Canadian side of the Great Lakes until the Americans pay their pre-war debts. It's a great way to make that leverage happen. The Spanish can do the same thing. The British are also able to hurt the United States by sending cheaply made finished goods into the country. Now, American manufacturing well, there really isn't American manufacturing. Just because we won our independence, no one went and flicked a giant switch that said from, colonial economy to modern. Nope. We were still very much, as far as the English were concerned, a part of the world that produced the raw materials in the South and in the North for the British and European manufacturing. So we don't have that industrial base and won't for a long time. So what the English do to further hurt us is to begin to send back into the United States inexpensive goods that if you are trying to manufacture some products, an American version of a chair, a gun, a clock, hats, and the European goods are coming back in, it's somewhat frustrating. And a lot of people had lived through the American Revolution and tightened their belt. They had holes in their socks. They wanted to buy new clothing. They wanted to buy new things. And the British basically accommodate them by saying, yeah, we'll send that stuff back over. If you can't pay for it, no worries. Buy it on credit, just like you did before the American Revolution. There are other areas around the world where the United States was facing this wake-up call that, oh no, we're not in the Great Britain, their system anymore. And it's happening in places that a lot of Americans don't know about to this day, and we should. In North Africa, the pirates there, and these were, again, several nations, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, which is modern-day Libya, and then further to the east, of course, you have part of the Ottoman Empire is Egypt. These are now modern nations of North Africa. They had strong connections to the Mediterranean world. But what these North African nations would do is often capture the ships of the Europeans, whether they be the French, the Dutch, or the English. And they would ransom their crew, and they would also take the cargo of these European ships. And then these European countries would say, how do we get you to stop harassing our trading ships? To which the North African governments would say, well, pay us a bribe. And the English did it. The French did. This is standard operating procedure. Cheaper to go pay the bribe than to go to war. And the United States says, well, wait a minute. Haven't you heard about our independence from Great Britain? And these governments of North Africa said, yeah, congratulations. You want to pay the bribe or what? We're not going to treat you any different than any other European country. And the difference is after 1783, we don't have to fly under the protection of the British flag. The problem is we don't have any money either to pay off these nations, so that we will have safe passage in the Mediterranean. And what happens in the 1780s is that American crews are kidnapped, and they have to have basically fundraising drives in places like New England to pay the ransom. Again, it's just another reminder among many others that our new status as a nation doesn't mean we're going to be treated fairly or equally around the world. Spain makes life tough for the United States, and this is going back to this map, because we are in a rivalry with them in the American Southwest. Again, the area that is the border between what is now Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Western Georgia, collectively known as the Southwest, this area south of the Ohio River. In 1784, the Spanish government closes the southern Mississippi River and closes American access to New Orleans. This is a devastating development. In the aftermath of the war, we think, all right, we've won, the British lost. What we get to do now is move at any speed we want into the areas that are now Western Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. Displacing the Indians, sometimes going to war. In the decade of the 1780s, something like 1,500 settlers die in Kentucky alone, giving the nickname of the region the Dark and Bloody Ground, representing the blood that is spilled among Native Americans and settlers in Kentucky. The reason people are heading west is you can use the Ohio River. You can notice of all the waterways, the Ohio River is marked on this map because it connects to the Mississippi. without decent roads, and there aren't any decent roads in the South except the old Indian path called the Natchez Trace, which is still around to this day. But without any decent roads, rivers are how you get around. If you are moving to Ohio, if you are moving to Kentucky or Tennessee, they're not states yet, they're territories. You use the rivers to take what you make or grow, send them down the Mississippi to New Orleans. If Spain says, sorry, United States, congrats on the whole independence thing. And we helped you. We helped liberate parts of Florida, Mobile, and even Baton Rouge, and wrestled them away from the British and helped your American independence. Well, all bets are off because now you're a rival to us. So that would dissuade you if you are a farmer or someone moving from Virginia to these new areas that you were hoping would open up. But you wouldn't maybe move there if it was dangerous. Or, said a different way, I love this slide because it shows you the influence. The Spanish represented out of St. Louis and Natchez and New Orleans, pointing, kind of thrusting towards the American territories in what's now the Illinois country, areas that are now Mississippi, the American Southwest. And the same is done in this map for the British out of the Great Lakes area near Fort Michilimackinac. I believe that's how it's pronounced, but it's in the Michigan territory, the old French trading post of Detroit, Fort Niagara. So these arrows are showing that the English can exert influence. They can provide, coaxing to the Indians in the area, the powerful Delaware, Shawnee confederacies that live in Western Pennsylvania and what's now Ohio. They can supply them with weapons and ammunition to stunt the growth of the United States. This, we might say, is like a containment policy. Now, we talk about containment when we are discussing the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s and making sure that the commies in Russia do not spread out to places like Korea and Vietnam and Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Containment, we want to contain global communism. Well, in this case, containment was the United States. We were moving at a breakneck speed across the continent, and that would threaten both the British in Canada and Spanish Louisiana. So you can see why they did it. The Spanish could provoke a powerful Creek Confederacy, the Creek Indians of the American Southwest. They are nearly as strong as the Iroquois in New York State. All of it is at play in the 1780s. Congress, we'll go back to the notes. And all controversies happening in the decade make a lot of people think that the current government under the United States, which is the first Constitution of the United States, it's called the Articles of Confederation. We talked about it last Friday in the discussion of the revolution and the social changes. Everyone who sees the challenges that we have also says that challenges cannot be met under the current government. Congress is at a loss, in the notes here, to solve any of these problems. Congress is weak on purpose. That's the way they designed it. But how long was that going to last? They're also dealing with people in Vermont who say, look, Congress, Vermont, you're thinking, isn't that a state? Nope, not one of the 13 colonies. It's going to be the 14th state later on. But people in the Vermont counties in what border New York say, hey, American government, the Congress, as it's called, if you don't address our needs to create our own territory and carve a state out of these counties, maybe we're better off dealing with, the English in Canada. The same is happening in Tennessee and areas of what's now eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, eastern Tennessee, which are at the time part of North Carolina. These settlers there say, look, if the government can't create a territory by which we can join and become a part of the existing United States, maybe we should throw our future behind the Spanish out of St. Louis. So this worries a lot of people. There doesn't seem to be any plan to settle the West. There doesn't seem to be any priority for settling the West. They also have to honor, through the Congress, the claims of those soldiers who lived through the war and were promised, because there was no money to pay them, they were promised, land. And that land would have to be set aside somewhere in the West. Where? Nobody knows. Because the land policy in the West was a complete nightmare. Let me show you this slide quickly. This one will make your head explode. These are states in the East that have claims in the West. You can look at areas of what is that? Wisconsin, claimed by Massachusetts, Virginia. You have areas that are now Illinois, claimed by Virginia. How in the world is that happening? So nothing can get done in Congress. One of the reasons why nothing can get done in Congress is that these states, the established 13 states from the 13 colonies, are debating where they have claims in the West. And Congress, their first step, if they're going to do anything to organize the territory we won as a result of our revolution, they're going to have to get these states to say, all right, let's turn this all over to Congress. But Congress is weak. Congress is weak on purpose. It's what the founders wanted when they created the Articles of Confederation. Let's get into some detail about that. Under the Articles of Confederation, which is the first Constitution of the United States, you need 9 states to make a law. 9 votes. Every state gets 1 vote. I don't care if Rhode Island has 2 representatives and Virginia has 11. Virginia gets a vote, Rhode Island gets a vote. Rhode Island loves it. It's like we're as strong as Virginia and New York and Massachusetts, the states with higher populations. Virginia hates it. But they had to make compromises. They had to make sacrifices so that some unified front could be presented to fight the British. A couple times during the war, they'd come up with a plan to raise money. Let's tax imports coming in. And that's great, except that you need, for that particular legislation to go through, all the states to vote yes. 13, unanimous. Basic laws needed 9 of 13 states to become the law. The tax on imports was going to be like a constitutional amendment, 13 states. So they got close, and on 2 occasions, 12 states voted for it and 1 opposed it. And when that happens, it can't go into law. And that is infinitely frustrating to the people who are in Congress. The Articles of Confederation formed, and this is a quote from the actual Articles of Confederation, a firm league of friendship and cooperation. Great. But some people are thinking, we won the American Revolution not because of Congress, but in spite of Congress. They were weak. They couldn't pay the army. They couldn't feed the army. How many rebellions and mutinies did we talk about Washington having to put down? 3, 2 or so by his enlisted men and 1 by the officers at the very end. There is no strong national government in the United States. Congress is the government. There is no executive branch. There is no judicial branch. There is just the Congress. It's one house, the Congress. Congressmen who go to that august body are limited. They're term limited. That's a novel idea that we didn't carry over into the new government, but that's a whole other topic. Few attend Congress because they go there and it's a glorified debating society and not so much a Congress. A lot of folks that served in Congress who were, again, the people we associate, Jefferson, Madison later on, Hamilton, serve in the Congress, and then they're like, nah, we're going to go back to our respective state because we can get things done there. Can't get anything done in the Congress. And to me, the prime example of not being able to get anything done is when the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that ends the revolution, that's 8 freaking years long, it comes into Congress, and the Congress says, well, we can't debate the articles under the Treaty of Paris because we don't have enough congressmen to form a minimum number in attendance to do anything. If any of you are in clubs on campus, maybe the idea of a quorum. If you're in some kind of organization, a fraternity, sorority, and you say, we need a minimum number of members to make any decision. They couldn't even get that when the peace treaty to end the war sat there for weeks until they could literally gather enough congressmen to vote on it. That's just a statement about the lack of prestige the Congress had during the decade of the 1780s. But a group in that Congress that served in the Congress was taking notice of these kind of shortcomings. They coalesce around an idea, or they gather and they put their thoughts together, and they're not sure how they're going to get it done, but they collectively become known as the Nationalists. Now, they didn't really go around wearing T-shirts saying, we're the Nationalists. They just say, look, at the very least, we should go back to the Articles of Confederation and consider giving it more power. That certainly has to be the case. It had existed ever since 1780. The war wasn't even over yet. And people, as I said last time when we were concluding the American Revolution, 1780 was the hinge year. If things didn't turn out better in 1780, and they eventually did, even though we have things like Benedict Arnold's treason, we have the surrender of Charleston, but at the very end, things look like they might turn around. There was even talk of the French saying, you know what, I know we signed the treaty and everything, but if the American government and the American army can't do anything, why should we stick around here? It's costing a hell of a lot of money to stay here with our army and our navy. So this group, known as the Nationalists, because they favor giving, or they would use the term back then, investing the national government with new or some power that the states have. Maybe just, give the right to regulate trade to, the Congress and not the individual states. Several of these nationalists weren't even staying in Congress. They've been veterans. And if you were a veteran, whether you were a lowly private or if you were a brigadier general, you can understand that the Congress was unable to pay the army or feed the army. So people in the states, those that had served in Congress but then went back to their respective state, army veterans, people in the citizenry were no doubt throwing up their hands saying, everything we've gone through so far, the domestic and foreign challenges, this current government is not up to dealing with. And who can blame them? Now, they may not represent a majority in the country, but they are a powerful group. They are articulate, they're smart, they're made up of people like Alexander Hamilton, like James Madison. I'd throw Washington in there as well. There are others at the state level. We're beginning to see that at the very least. Let's consider the idea of giving Congress, and Congress alone, not the states, certain powers. It makes a lot of sense. At the same time, there are just as many, if not more, people who say, what are you all talking about? Strengthening the national government? Hadn't we fought a long revolution against this? When you concentrate power in one area, tyranny is the result. An abridgment of your rights and liberties. I'm sorry, hadn't you all just lived just like me? I don't believe there's a problem now in the government, in the Congress. I think we'll be fine. And those of you who want to create a stronger government, I think, seem to have forgotten what we were all about during the 1760s and 70s. It's the time-honored refrain, why would you replace British tyranny with American tyranny? And that is a good point. That leads back full circle to what I just started this discussion with. You can say that the 1780s are a critical period. Everything we fought for is about to go down the tubes. We are susceptible to being picked apart. New nations born from colonies often are considered fair game when other Europeans swoop in. Part of our history as a nation has been to say, whether it be in places like Latin America, Central America, maybe not Haiti is so much, and we're a little inconsistent with this policy, but we say, just like us, our independence started from an anti-colonial rebellion. And we know we're militarily weak, we know we're economically weak, but we don't have to be reminded of it all the time. And so these countries might swoop in. That was a sense that people had among the nationalists. We're going to divide, basically, and Europeans said this too. I mean, no nation can exist the size of the United States in 1783, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, you don't have any example in human history of a almost continent-size republic lasting. I mean, you can have them in Switzerland. Switzerland's tiny. And the old Greek and maybe Roman city-states in their infancy. But a republic, and I don't mean a republic as in the Republican Party, I mean the Republican form of government, where you choose the representatives and they make decisions for you. That doesn't exist on a continent-wide basis. And so there's an idea that we'll probably split up into a confederation of New England, the middle states, and the states that have plantations and the economies based on slavery being a critical part, might branch off into three, and then the West will be a fourth. And that's what people in Europe expect. The American experiment is going to come undone. The one success, and we've been beating up the Congress for a long time now in this discussion, that they do have, does take place in that already mentioned land policy. Let's go back to the slide here and talk about a couple things that the Confederation gets right. This is a mess, obviously. And what the government first had to do, the national government, the Congress, is to tell these states, if we are going to set policy in the West, all of you, I mean, you know, Virginia, you're going to have a Western border. And Virginia says, well, in our charter of 1607, our border was California. Well, they didn't use California, but they literally meant the Pacific Ocean. So Congress said, if we're going to get anything done, we're going to have all of you, the established 13 states, renounce your claims to the West and let Congress deal with Western land policy. And finally, it happened in the 1780s. It's a small baby steps, and it's a progression. The first step is to organize selling land. That happens with the 1785 Land Act. That's great. You can buy land for $1 an acre. Unfortunately, you have to buy a minimum of something like 600 acres, and you have to provide cash. Ugh. Nobody has it. Nobody has it. So at least the policy is set by which you're going to create in the area above the Ohio River. Congress setting policy by which you sell the Land Act, and you can see here, it's a little confusing to look at, but if you've ever flown over the central part of the country, you see a grid from the plane. This is why. This is the township pattern, the surveys for the townships that were part of the 1785 Land Act, setting aside areas for schools, for public use, and then to raise revenue for the nation, you would sell the land to speculators and investors and individuals. Sounds great. That's step one. Step two is, all right, we've got this whole area. Now we're going to concentrate on the area in green, the area to the north and west of the Ohio River, and it's called the Northwest Territory. 5 future states. Thomas Jefferson wrote the legislation for the Land Act, and he said, we're going to have these fantastic, 7, 8 states, be like, Goodlandia, and he had all these really highfalutin Latin names, Good Timesikins or whatever. He came up with all these potential names for future states out west. And instead we took other geographic and Native American names, which in some ways are appropriate and, again, make the connection to these areas. 5 future states in the Northwest Territories. All right, fine, we sold the land. People are going to move out there, settlers, by the hundreds and the thousands. How do we bring in each of these territories, 5 become 5 future states, and make them on the equal footing of the already established 13 states? This happens in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. The term for it is there in the notes as I'm talking over the slide here. You're going to carve 5 future territories and go through a process. At first, Congress will name the territory. And we're going to use the first one because the first state to get carved out of the Northwest Territory is Ohio here, where this range is surveyed, kind of comes out of that part of the map with a greater detail. So let's concentrate on Ohio. 5 future states that are eventually settled by the 18 teens, but Ohio first, 1803. Okay, so Congress will name in and following the Northwest Ordinance a territorial governor with a council. So there is some kind of government. Now, it's not perfectly democratic government, but nevertheless, Congress will name, and usually the territorial governor is a military man because these areas are not all the time very safe, and you have to keep something of a military force in the area. When the population reaches a certain threshold, it's 5,000, they can choose a legislature and write a constitution. They have a panel of judges. They are promised religious toleration, and they're given the basic Bill of Rights under the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. So as each population threshold, it's like kind of jumping through hoops. When your population increases, you get to have more representative government. And then when you reach 60,000, that's the threshold of population, you can write an official territorial constitution, and hopefully that will be a state constitution, and submit it to Congress. And then Congress votes on statehood. And when you join, when Ohio joins in 1803, the first state to be carved out of the Northwest Ordinance, the Northwest Territories, they are on equal footing with the other states. And you think, okay, so what, big deal, that makes sense. But what you don't understand possibly is that in the European model, if we were to get land this way, the folks in Ohio would be in kind of a second class, we might say, probationary status, and not have all the citizenship rights that the people of the older states would get, such as Virginia, North Carolina, New York, Massachusetts. In the Northwest Ordinance, they said, when you reach the statehood and Congress votes on it, you're a state, and by the time we have a statehood, you have what? A representative, senators in the US Congress. It's great. So it's a unique American innovation. The other very significant part of the Northwest Ordinance is that Congress votes in that territory that slavery will be prohibited in all of the Northwest territories. It's the beginning of a story where we have part of the nation where slavery is legal and part of it where it is not, because we got, real close. The territories south of the Ohio River, Kentucky, Tennessee, the future states of Alabama and Mississippi, we get real close to banning slavery from there. I think it was literally one vote, and it didn't happen. But slavery is banned in the Northwest territories. At the territorial stage, later on, there will be no slave states there, but they will exist in the Southwest territories. Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi will all make slavery legal. So what do you do if, in spite of this success, you still think it is necessary to enhance the powers of the national government and allow Congress to do certain things? We have a mishmash of policy, they say. Indian policy is set in some ways by the national government, by the state government. Places like Connecticut are just absolutely getting clobbered economically because the Connecticut people are saying, look, the states can regulate their own trade laws. You know, when you move products from Texas into Louisiana, there is no impost or tariff on these products crossing a state line. That's because only Congress, the U.S. National Congress, can regulate that area of the economy. Back in 1787, that wasn't the case. So the people in Connecticut were faced with this really, really difficult problem. Their goods crossing from Connecticut into New York had to pay a tax that was higher than goods coming from England and the freaking ocean to get into New York. That didn't seem right. And so at the very least, a lot of these nationalists are saying, let Congress and Congress alone regulate interstate commerce. That seemed like a good idea. And if you have enough people with various levels of disagreement, but at the same time with one kind of overall overreaching purpose, let's make the national government a little bit stronger. We're not asking to completely throw over the Articles of Confederation, not that we're going to do that, wink, wink, nod, nod, they did. But let's get the Nationalists to call a meeting, and that meeting will take place in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland. So you get a number of representatives from the different states. And the Annapolis Convention was an effort, a first effort, to enhance the role of the national government. 5 states send delegates. 5 out of 13. Oh, great. Remember we talked about the whole quorum thing? We ought to have a minimum to make any kind of decision for 13. And 5 ain't going to cut it. In fact, the people in Annapolis, which is this little up-and-coming town in Maryland, it will house, of course, and be the home of the Naval Academy. So this little port town, Annapolis, the officials there get wind of what's happening. That a group of interested individuals, including congressmen, are going to use their official building to conduct the Annapolis Convention. They padlock the door shut, so they can't meet there. So there's a certain amount of distrust when nationalists get together and have their agenda, which maybe will go forward. So what they do in Annapolis, and to their everlasting credit, they decide, all right, fine. Obviously, 5 representatives of 5 states can't make decisions for everyone else. What is our next agenda, or what should we attempt if we're going to continue this idea that we have? And they said, let's meet the following year. What we'll do as we leave Annapolis and make no decisions other than in May of 1787, sometime in the spring, they say, we're going to have a meeting in Philadelphia. So we'll wait a year. We'll hopefully be able to build more momentum and get more interest. You can't make a decision for all of the United States when only 5 states send any kind of representatives. But what will happen next year in Philadelphia is we'll get more of the states to send representatives, and there we can make a decision. In the meantime, if you are a nationalist, if you are Madison, 5'3", 100 pounds wet, this guy, always is a man in a rush because he is something of a hypochondriac, thinks every time he gets a cold, this is the one that kills me, I'm going to die. Lives into his 80s. but Madison, a plantation owner, a slave owner, very well connected in Virginia society. And then we bring in Hamilton. Basically orphaned. Father was a no-good Scots journeyman. Mother raised him until she died, born in the British island of Nevis, moved to St. Croix when he's college age, everybody. He makes his way to New York, goes to King's College, which is now Columbia University, begins to write in support of American independence. You know a little bit of the rest of the story. Serves as an officer in the Continental Army, Washington's aide-de-camp, and then gets elected to Congress. These 2 distinctly different backgrounds are the leaders of the nationalist movement. Now, they will have a huge falling out later on in the 1790s, but for now, they're on the same page. How they got there is a little bit differently. Madison goes to college. Hamilton went to war. And so they get back with at least the same mindset that we're going to need to, at the very minimum, get enough interest in the idea of revisiting the Articles of Confederation, which is the wartime constitution of the United States. It was drafted very quickly. It took a while to ratify, and clearly it's not really up to the task, but we can maybe fix it. We can get enough people to get in one place, one building, in one city, in one spring of 1787. We can get everyone to agree to that and make some changes. But in between the Annapolis Convention, 1786, and the Philadelphia meeting, as they're calling it, they don't call it the Constitutional Convention yet. We will, because we know what comes out of it. A tailor-made crisis erupts in Massachusetts. Chaos at the end of 1786 and the beginning of 1787. It's called in Massachusetts and American history the Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a veteran of the American Revolution. He had been an officer in the Continental Army, and he is seen as the leader of a group of very disgruntled farmers in Western Massachusetts. They owe money to creditors back east, people who, again, they had borrowed money from these folks. The economy in the aftermath of the American Revolution wasn't very good. They wanted, the people who rally around Daniel Shays, they wanted the state legislature to say, look, maybe this year, because the economy isn't good, you don't pay your tax to vote, a poll tax, a tax on your land. Shays and his supporters were seeing their land foreclosed upon when they couldn't pay the state taxes. Massachusetts is trying to pay down its state debt. National debt? I mean, there's no way to get any money, so there's no way to pay off a national debt. Congress is completely inept and weak. But the states individually were trying to pay down their level of debt, and Massachusetts was doing it by taxing people at a higher rate that they ever complained about under the British system. And so Daniel Shays and his rebels are armed. They put together a group that's going to march on the Capitol. Those who are in the legislature back on the East Coast of Massachusetts, they put together their own militia force. They have a skirmish near Springfield, which is where Daniel Shays and his rebels are targeting to capture more guns. The Shays rebels are dispersed, but it sends Shays Rebellion, 1786, 1787 in Massachusetts, shockwaves through the American community. People like Washington, remember the greatest exit in American history? Drop the mic, I'm out of here, retire from the Army. He's writing his friend Henry Knox in Massachusetts saying, what the hell's going on up there? Are the British involved? Is this Canadian intrigue? He actually asks Knox. Are British agents out of Canada inciting Shays rebels? Is it going to happen? Will there be copycat rebellions, Washington asks, in other states as they put in debtor relief laws? Now, Shays Rebellion causes Massachusetts to change its policy. They had an armed, almost civil war in the state. But the nationalists are like, you know, if you're Hamilton or Madison, you may publicly say, oh, I can't believe this is shameful, terrible. And then in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, perfect. Because the entire Annapolis convention hadn't worked. And in between Annapolis, which is a joke because nobody shows up, and our upcoming meeting in Philadelphia, we get this to happen. Shays Rebellion, a tailor-made crisis for the nationalist cause. So we will have an assemblage of what Thomas Jefferson will say later is a meeting of the demigods as they meet in Philadelphia starting in May 1787. The other issue is that James Madison has to work almost single-handedly to draft Tall Guy to go to the meeting. We all know who he is. The Virginia legislature is one of several state governments that has to pick representatives to go to the meeting in Philadelphia. Madison tells Washington at the end of 1786, your name's on the list. He's like, I can't go. Madison says, why not? He says, well, there's this other meeting I'm supposed to go to, and I've already turned them down. So if I turn them down and go to this one, it's not going to look good. I'm old. Remember the greatest exit in history? What in the world are we going to do in Philadelphia, Madison? And Madison says to him, well, not exactly sure, but I do know, and Washington has to have in the back of his mind that the Annapolis Convention was an absolute disaster. What if Washington shows up at Philadelphia and their attendance is awful and they all go home? He said that will forever be linked to my coming out of retirement and embarrassing myself. Madison says to him, you know what, Your Excellency, that's what they call Washington, sign of respect. If you don't go and it is a success, what will happen then? And Washington's like, oh, good point. Washington also brings up the fact that whatever y'all are going to do there in Philadelphia, isn't it a repudiation of the American Revolution? I mean, a lot of people died, and, I was a general in charge of the army that fought for the Constitution that is the Articles of Confederation. Aren't we kind of possibly throwing that out? And Madison's like, damn, I didn't know Washington was such a complicated constitutional thinker. And he was. But it's Madison and others who say, if you are there, and this, you cannot underestimate this statement. If other people know around the country that Washington's going there, they'll feel better about going. Because he often doesn't make bad decisions, and they have faith that if he's there, they're not going to do anything that's bad or returns American tyranny in place of British tyranny that they had fought so long